I know filming outdoors isn't as popular with some of my bookier subscribers as it is with other people, but you know, if you've never watched any of these out and about videos, I hope you are watching this one, because I always talk about books during them, as anybody who watches these will tell you. And I guess maybe we could talk at this point about the difference between science fiction and fantasy. In the Elements of SF series, I've talked about how the novum, the new thing, is a key indicator of what science fiction is. It's the tipping point that allows a paradigm shift and a conceptual breakthrough into a new reality, and it's caused by technological means, or at least the excuse, the rationale that the author uses in such a story is to give it a technological explanation. Now, it doesn't really matter if the science isn't actually very strong. What matters is that the author is showing confidence and faith in the ability of science to create paradigm shifts and to move technology and thus society forward. Not always into a good area, as we've seen from dystopian SF. So really, SF is a post-Enlightenment project. We have to accept science and the scientific worldview that excludes the irrational, the superstitious, the religious, the magical. So really, science fiction isn't so much about the detail of the science, it's more about accepting and admitting that science is a shifter of paradigm, and it's an effective one, and that it works. So really, it's showing confidence in the scientific, objective, rational, post-Enlightenment Western worldview. So think of Arthur and Merlin and all the sort of magical and religious stuff that you get in the Chronicles. Let's apply that to the whole sort of narrative and discussion of the difference between SF and fantasy. Of course, if you talk about fantasy, you think to yourself about how SF differentiates itself from general fiction with the use of the novum, and you think, well, maybe there's that in fantasy as well. You know, maybe the novum in fantasy is magic, the supernatural, religion. Sometimes it's just a secondary world. You know, you get sort of broader fantasy novels, literary ones very often, where they're just set in a secondary world. And if you take, for example, Middle-earth, you could say, you know, it's Europe in the Dark Ages or before that, because it has lots of similarities. Brian Bates wrote a book about that, actually, The Real Middle-earth, which is worth a look. But of course, the novums, the tropes that we get in fantasy, let's focus on sword and sorcery specifically, because fantasy is so broad. Things like the dragon, the sword, the wizard, the quest, all those things, they're all archaic, they're all anachronisms. They're not things which we would get in a contemporary or future narrative unless they're created by science. Let's say there is a future narrative where there are those things, unless they are the creations of science. For example, in the Pern novels by Anne McCaffrey, where there are dragons on that distant planet on Pern. But of course, they're genetically engineered and modified. So it's SF. So the symbolism, the tropes appear to be like fantasy, but the rationale is SF. So the thing to look at with fantasy and science fiction and distinguishing the two is it magic or is it science? Magic doesn't exist, or if it does, let's see it work. Let's see it work consistently in the way that science does. And of course, we have no proof that magic exists. And if it does, that it is consistent, that it does work. Maybe it's science we haven't discovered yet. The old Arthur C. Clarke quotation, the very unhelpful one, about how any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Well, it will be to a culture which is more primitive and doesn't understand science. But we will make an assumption when we meet aliens from other planets, for example, who have advanced technology, that what they're doing is scientific, not magical. That dictum of Clarke's, as I say, is really, really unhelpful, because, of course, what you're talking about with the equivalent of the novum in fantasy is something which isn't scientific. It's not a novum, it's not a new thing, and this is the key point. It's an anachronism. It's something archaic. that speaks of the past, that speaks of the pre-Enlightenment world, of the world before we discovered and systematized science. And of course, science was already there. It was a system like mathematics, which already existed in the stuff of the universe. We accept that science is science because it works, because it's consistent. You do an experiment, you repeat it. And, if you look at the novum in the real world, as science made different discoveries, when those discoveries were made, they were novums, they were new things, and they created paradigm shifts. So science fiction is more akin to mimetic fiction, to realistic fiction, than it is to fantasy when you get down to the nub of it. Of course, people can't see it that way because they haven't thought about it. If you think about it and think about the novum and the paradigm shift, then this is the whole thing. You can say, well, a lot of the novums in SF are highly unlikely, they're not very scientific, but the point is that they are explained scientifically by the author. They are given the excuse or the justification or the rationale of science. I've said this already, I know, but it's very important. So really, science fiction isn't about actual science. It's about a belief and faith in the scientific worldview, and the fact that we've all seen science repeat experiments and come up with consistent results all the time, unlike magic or religion. So when we talk about the difference between science fiction and fantasy, remember the novum. Look for something which is inserted in the text by the author, which is a scientific or technological little bit of innovation that shifts the paradigm. If you're reading something that appears to be science fiction, look at Star Wars as a classic example of this. It's set in space, on other planets, there's spaceships, all sorts of scientific stuff in it. However, it has the Force. Now, I'm no Star Wars expert. To me, it's a kid's film, though I do like the throne room sequence at the end where they get their medals and what have you. Don't know what really does it for me. Perhaps it's Carrie Fisher. But the real point is that the Force is this sort of mystical thing. Is it scientifically explained in any of the films? I don't know. I'm not enough of a devotee, as I say. But at least in Star Wars, the initial film, which is now called Star Wars A New Hope, it never was at the time, it's very, very much a thing where that's a mystical insight that allows Luke to sort of hit the button at the right time, because he hasn't had a lot of training and stuff, really. He just happens to be an ace. Or is it because his dad's a Jedi, and he's had the training and there's some genetic daring do with the Jedi, a bit like the Bene Gesserit and Dune? I don't know, I'm not enough of a Star Wars fan, as I say. But the real point is this: if the Force is mystical and magical, well then it's fantasy, not science fiction. It doesn't matter there's spaceships in it, as long as you allow the presence of superstition, the irrational, the mystical, magic, religion, the supernatural to take place in a narrative of this kind. It ceases to be SF and it becomes fantasy. Science fiction is about the natural, not the supernatural. This very much ties in with what I've said about horror, how horror is not a genre but it's a bricolage. Some of it is SF, some of it is fantasy, and some of it is crime. Similarly, of course, you can have a milieu which appears to be a fantastic one and then is yet revealed to be scientific, that has scientific truths behind it. Of course, there's elements of this in the Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe and in the Draconium sequence by M. John Harrison. And science fantasy is a term you don't hear much these days, and not a very useful one because it tends to muddy the waters. But I guess with questions around Clark Asher-Smith's Zothique, around Jack Vance's Dying Earth, around the Earth of the New Sun, around Draconium, and similar things, there is this question about, is this fantasy, is it magic, or is it science, or is it science clothed as magic? Those sort of science fantasy narratives are very interesting for writers to play around with, and the fact that sometimes they're ambiguous doesn't invalidate the argument about the novum and the paradigm shift as being scientific and technological. Not at all, because it simply sort of throws into relief, because what you're looking for is if you want to use the categories, and some people are against categories, but they are useful and they do underpin a certain philosophical standpoint in fiction, general fiction, strict reality, whatever is possible at that moment, science fiction which extrapolates on the basis of the novum, and fantasy in which anything goes, but it's an anything goes that is allowed by the presence of the supernatural, not the natural. Take Terry Brooks. I mean, I'm not a huge Terry Brooks fan, but if you look at The Sword of Shannara, the book which in 1977 started the fantasy boom, where suddenly everything had to go down the Tolkien-esque formula of the bloated trilogy that never ended and so on. You know, the explanation in that for the apparently magical tropes of, you know, elves or gnomes or dwarves and wizards, whatever you have in that, they're supposedly caused by genetic mutation of a nuclear war, which is at least interesting. So of course what we're talking about in that case is, you know, a science fiction novum, nuclear war and radiation and mutation, as the cause of an awakening of, you know, magical, in inverted commas, beings, you know, parenthetic. But I've not read enough of them to say, but that's, again, maybe it's science fantasy. But the whole point is that you can see what I'm getting at in distinguishing between science fiction and fantasy. You look at whether there's a novum or an anachronism. The anachronisms of fantasy, all the tropes which you would say are novums, or the equivalent of a novum, in shifting the story out of realism into the fantastic, were around before the Enlightenment. Magic, superstition. So that's cleared my head, and those are some thoughts about how the novum is central to distinguishing between science fiction and fantasy, and how the presence of the supernatural in any form, even in what appears to be a science fiction narrative, even if there are science fiction tropes present, it means that the work is ultimately fantasy. If the supernatural is real in the story and remains supernatural and is not explained by science and assimilated into science, at which point it becomes natural, at which point the narrative is science fiction, you see what I'm going with this, then if the supernatural is allowed, if magic and religion are a real thing, a real corporate thing in the story, then it ceases to be SF despite any SF trappings.